some people are good at hiding their emotions and other people are not. We go into things with an assumption that everyone leaks things sometimes, and therefore we can trust certain people more than others. I'm going to do 4 things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to do some setup as to what this world looks like. Secondly, I'm going to talk about privacy, why we think that's important. Thirdly, I'm going to look at why it's better for individuals to hide their own emotions. And fourthly, I'm going to look at why it's good to know that other people's emotions are intentional when they're displayed. In substantive, we're also going to talk about hot guys. So, firstly, in terms of setup here, we think that people, how this will work is you will still get the natural impulse to do certain things and react to things in certain ways, but you will have the chance kind of instantaneously as that instinct arises to turn off that emotion and stop it from being displayed, to turn off that reaction from your body. I think that understands the topic totally. I think the other thing to say is therefore you won't be any better at faking an emotion that you don't have, but you'll be better at faking you don't, you'll be perfect at faking emotions that if you do have it, that don't want to display it. Moving on then, substantially. Privacy, why I think it's important, why I think it's better facilitated on the outside of the house. The first thing is to say is that unintentional responses leak secrets that you would rather keep private. And we think that it's regrettable that people don't have control over that ability. The important thing to say here is that a lot of these things are your internal thoughts and an accidental expression of those thoughts in ways to reveal personal things about yourself to other individuals. The second thing we'd say on privacy then is that it shows weaknesses and puts you in a position of vulnerability at the point in time where that occurs. Because it reveals that information, but importantly that information that gets revealed is often in quite high pressure environments where that is something where you particularly do not want that to be something which the other person would see. And I think briefly touching then on what this privacy looks like is it's the same as if someone could partially read your mind or could see part of your Facebook conversations or things like that. And critically, as I'll go on to talk about later in this speech, not only reading it that it's just bad in general privacy that someone has the ability to do any of that at all, but the fact that it is partial actually makes it worse in many circumstances as a result. The third thing we'd say here though in terms of privacy is we think it's unjust to the extent that different people are able to hide this to different degrees. You are naturally able to keep your emotions to yourself differently depending on who you are. We think that is something which is partially trained, partially inherent to who you are, but importantly, it isn't distributed evenly between different people, which gives certain people that I want to talk about later in this debate an unfair advantage over others. Fourthly, we think looking at this unfair distribution, it particularly affects the way that minorities will act. So for example, women are encouraged to act more happy in general, which makes an accidental slip up or revealing of that information more likely because they are more performative in general. So when that is something which slips up, that is something which people are able to attach on and see, whereas men who keep their emotions more reserved are less likely to make those types of accidental slip-ups, so they're less told to play up their emotions to other people. The second thing is we talk about people who are encouraged to be restrained in certain ways, and people value those kinds of qualities. If that is true, then we think people who currently have the ability to hide their emotions to a greater degree than others are benefited as a result. That means that the second part of this principle then says that because this distribution is unjust, we would rather a world where that distribution was perfectly equal between different people. So that concludes privacy. Second thing to look at in this speech is why it's better for individuals to be able to hide their own emotions. A couple of things to say here. The first is to look at a couple of different types of emotions which we think are important to hide. The first of those being fear and vulnerability. Because I think that a majority of bullying and harassment occurs, it occurs towards individuals who look worried or scared. We think that is structurally true because of the fact that the bully perceives this as someone who they will get a reaction from, and therefore that is something where they would choose to pick on them as a target in the first place. But secondly, under our world, you would not get that reaction from that person because of the fact that they are able to hide it. So the conclusion of what we see there is that you are able to get bullied less yourself as someone who is able to hide those particular emotions in the first place. The second emotion that I want to look at then is sadness, because I think that when I think what this allows you to do under our model is express your sadness to other people at the point you choose, in the way that you choose. But the problem with extreme emotions like that is that if you receive particularly bad news in front of other people, you might react to that by crying. You may not want to do that, but that is the natural reaction. You should have the ability to choose whether or not that is the way that you want to perform in front of others. The third thing we'd say within this speech is that some people, it will make people more proactive about asking after others and how they are going. So, what that looks like is, I think, for example, with parents, a lot of the time they wait to ask their children how they were going until they perceive that that child is seeming down or perceive that that child might potentially be sad. But I think the crucial thing to note here is that a lot of children in general might be feeling sad, but also a lot of children who have mental health issues, and particularly those who have mental health issues which are prolonged and lead to quite a lot of harm for those children, are good at hiding those things from their parents, but their parents don't realise that those children are good because because they are told in general in society that people aren't very good at hiding their emotions, and they don't expect that their own child will be able to do that instead. So at the point in time this parent realizes that their child might be good at hiding their emotions, they're more likely to talk to them on a regular basis rather than waiting for them to sink down, but also they're more likely to kind of work out what's, dig into what's going on and work out how that child actually is, rather than, especially at the point in time they know this child can say different things in response. The fourth thing we'd say here is that this is the only way to find out about the state of being here. Because I think the important thing to recognise is that it works the other way around as well. When you realise that people are sometimes displaying emotions accidentally at the moment, what that means is often they might be intentionally showing you that they feel sad, but you think that it's an accident. So they are actively sad and want you to ask them how they're going, but you choose not to ask because you're worried that they're doing that accidentally. Under this side, if you want someone to ask you how you are and you display sadness to that person, they know for certain that that is intentional and that they want a response from you in order to benefit them. I think that is hugely important because for a lot of people, this step of actively asking someone to engage with them is much, much harder than trying to show that person emotionally that you need them. And under our side, we guarantee a response for those particular individuals, which does not happen in the status quo. That is why, on all four of those points, we think it's better for individuals to be able to hide their own emotions, but have control over expressing them when they choose to. Fourthly, why is it good to know that other people's emotions are intentional? The first thing I'm going to say here is floating back to the idea of the distribution that I talked about, is that it's better that this power is distributed to everyone. Because yes, I think to some extent this will, I think this will increase skepticism of how people are behaving and skepticism of the truth and whether or not people are being truthful. But that is something which we support when in the status quo, some people do have the ability to use that to their advantage. But people don't have that skepticism and they take them at their word. They think that that person is trustworthy. They think that they are acting like a normal person would. Second thing I'm going to say here is I think it leads to less misunderstanding of other people's intentions. That is to say that I think when you unintentionally leak parts of what you're thinking, that leads to someone reading into it and having misintentions as a result of that. That looks like things where someone, for example, starts crying when they break up with you, and at that point in time you get the impression in your head that maybe they actually don't want to do that, but at the point in time when they're able to control that emotion, they can protect you to a greater extent. The third thing I'm going to say here is it's harder to justify your bad behaviour in these circumstances. I think a lot of the time at the moment, people are excused for being dickheads because you're just like, oh, it was heat of the moment, whatever. Those heat of the moment things no longer happen. So if someone is intentionally doing those things, you can see it, call them out for being a dickhead, and that is something which they will stop doing. And that is particularly true in cases for men, for example, when they're aggressive by swearing or being intimidating. Those things now you cannot excuse as a natural reaction, but instead you say you intentionally acted in that particular way and you were wrong as a result. At the conclusion of this speech, I think this is absolutely crucial to protect vulnerable individuals who otherwise are exposed to society, and for that reason we're very proud to oppose.
Andrew, that would be really horrible. The world in which individuals consciously express their emotions is one that reinforces the inherent power dynamics that exist in society and encourage individuals to seek to control the way in which others express themselves. It's one in which individuals are denied the opportunity to express the most important parts of communication through unintentional cues, and it's one that encourages people to bottle up their negative emotions instead of displaying them in a way that is healthy. First thing I'm going to do in this speech is briefly rebut the argument about privacy. I suppose the first thing to note about this is that even if you accept all of their analysis, it's relatively toothless for the reason that individuals generally consent to the level of a lack of privacy that exists in society currently through things like engaging with it more broadly, which means that even if it's the case that this robs individuals of privacy to some extent, it's a relatively toothless principle because it's an expectation that you grow up with and become accustomed to in a way that does not fundamentally violate your rights in any way that is significantly harmful. The second thing to say is that often the ways in which you can disclose secrets accidentally do not disclose the substance of those secrets in a way that violates your privacy to any significant extent. You might disclose that you're unhappy about something. It's not necessarily to disclose what it is you're unhappy about or why you do that. And thirdly, often you do consent to the disclosure of information potentially. The reason that often you're in the social situations where you do receive bad news, you're more likely to know which people are likely to be around you. Like if I'm at the break announcement at on break night at Australs, I kind of know the types of people around me and the people to whom I could potentially disclose that information, which makes it exactly like the way in which you disclose information selectively to people on your newsfeed and Facebook instead of to the general public. Let's move on substantively firstly to the way in which this reinforces pernicious power dynamics. So the first thing to say is that this makes the display of emotions controllable in the ways that displays of language and of communication are controllable more generally in a number of ways. Firstly, because it makes the display of your emotions more intrinsically tied to the expression of other aspects of your personhood than they are in the status quo, where they're more likely to be treated as accidental. So, for instance, it's a more conscious decision that you make that indicates things about yourself, as opposed to something that you do accidentally. Secondly, the fact that you can consciously control the ways in which you display your emotions makes it something that is inherently more controllable than something that is often accidental. So it encourages people to say to you, you should control your emotions in these circumstances and not others. And thirdly, often the way in which this world would operate is that there's a kind of semiotic aspect to the way in which you display emotions in a way that is not true under the status quo. The reason that the way in which emotions are discussed are things like precisely what Andrew says. You should display your emotions in these situations and not others. Displaying your emotion in this way and not this way indicates a certain thing about the way in which that expression is understood by other people. The harms of this are manifold. The first and most important one is that it generates expectations about the types of emotions that you are allowed to display, and those expectations are significantly more compulsory and entrenched than they are under the status quo. Because as opposed to doing something that's accidental and excusable, it's something that you consciously choose to do, which locks people out of displaying those emotions in situations where they would be important to them. For instance, it means that it reinforces the disparities in class and race that exist in society, for instance, when it suggests that an African-American person making the decision to be angry about something is less susceptible than that decision made when it's made by a white man, because it interrelates to all of the other social narratives that exist about what is acceptable behaviour for white people as opposed to black people. And secondly, it makes it significantly more difficult to relate between cultures, because we think this alternative world is one in which people develop the language of the conscious expression of emotion in different ways to each other when those societies are separate, which makes it significantly more difficult to understand other people and their expression of emotion, because it's something that they control using the cultural norms that have been developed over time as a result of the conscious control that they have of their emotions, as opposed to something that's universal, yeah? So this leads to a significant loss of empathy between individuals of different cultures. It leads to a significant reinforcement of the most pernicious and difficult to break out of power dynamics in society. That is the first harm that the affirmative team must contend with. The second they must contend with is that this robs individuals of the richness of unintentional cues, which are the fundamental fabric of the way in which people relate to one another. First reason for this is that often the most honest way in which you relate to other people is by disclosing unintentionally things to them. It gives people an access to the more inner parts of your personality. Secondly, it's more accurate reflection of precisely what your thoughts are, because it's an unconscious disclosure of those emotions, which means it's more likely to be true. And thirdly, often it's difficult to verbalize specifically the emotion that you feel. So for instance, even if I were to want to verbalize the fact that I were happy to someone, it would be more difficult for me to do so, even if I have only a split second to decide whether or not to verbalize it, because you still consider what the meaning of that verbalization would be in the context in which you verbalize it, as opposed to under the status quo when it's a genuine and unmediated kind of expression of your innermost emotions. The harms of that are several. The first of those is that people constantly question whether or not the emotion you are displaying is real, which means that it's significantly less likely that individuals will be empathetic, because they understand that people only choose to disclose those emotions at points in which they choose to do so, which makes it significantly more likely that, for instance, you double guess your friends as to whether or not they're expressing something to manipulate you. If they care about other people in society, significantly less likely that you'll be empathetic towards them, because you view their expressions of emotions as something that's strategic to them, as opposed to something that they disclose organically. Thirdly, it makes it more difficult to consciously express emotion. It's difficult to consciously express emotions all of the time, yeah? This creates a significant degree of emotional labor for people when they have to decide which emotions they choose to express and which ones they do not, which means that the most fundamental forms of communication, like the friends that you look at your friends in a different way than you would look at acquaintances because you love your friends and you don't love random people on the street, makes those relationships significantly weaker because you can't engage in that constant emotional communication all of the time. Finally, this makes you significantly more disingenuous, because if you can control perfectly the way in which you display emotions to other people, that makes it more legitimate for you to control other ways in which you express your personhood to individuals that justifies the way in which people are allowed to lie to their friends, for instance, in ways which we think fundamentally harm their relationship with them. But finally, this means that you would never choose to display negative emotions and choose to bottle them up instead. There are a number of reasons to believe that this is true. Firstly, for the reasons I've already discussed with respect to the way that these norms would be attached to other norms of power in society. Secondly, And lots of emotions, especially negative ones, are associated with deep shame because they reveal vulnerabilities about yourself. Even positive emotions like happiness reveal that you are only reacting to someone else, which gives those other individuals power over you, which means that you're unlikely to express them a significant degree of the time. Thirdly, the reason that the time lag in which you have to consider whether or not a situation would be a strategic one to use your emotional response in makes you consider those emotions that makes you view it objectively as opposed to something that's subjective and inherent to yourself. Fourthly, the reason that often there is this norm in society that now says that it's more unusual when you choose to express an emotion as opposed to something that constantly occurs in each and every interaction that you have with other people. And fifthly, because it makes because you're making a choice to appear sad or because you're making a choice to appear distressed, it makes, firstly, it significantly more likely that you would elect not to for the reason that it's shameful. And secondly, you feel bad about the societal pressure to not put burdens upon other people, to burden other people with your emotions. What is the harm of that? Firstly, it means that you pent up your emotions. You can't express them in ways that help disclose those emotions to other people, that help you vent about your anger, and you're significantly less likely to do so in ways that are harmful to you. So you still experience that anger, but now there's significant societal pressure. Come on, don't look at me like that. The second thing to say is it means that you're less likely to be able to seek help because you're significantly less likely to disclose that you're sad or depressed. So anger speech is just uncomparative, yeah? Like, under the status quo, at least some of the time you notice that people appear to be down. In their world, those people are forced by every other social norm that exists in society to hide those emotions and never reveal them to other people. This is a horrible, horrible idea of this person.
Thank Kevin for that speech. I welcome the second round of speaker Will.
Talks about unintentionally expressing emotions in a way that is almost out of like a romantic comedy, where in like the serendipity of the moment you smile at someone you find attractive, you show your love accidentally to someone. And if individuals still felt that love to others, still felt happiness, they probably would still show it because the world around them in which they grew up would say that you can still obviously express your emotions. It's good to talk to others about your emotions and so on. But what this stops is things like, that I'm sure many of us have been through, is remembering the time where you wish you didn't like break down crying in public, remembering the time where your friend asked if you were gay and you went red-faced and weren't able to answer that question persuasively, asked about a time like that young girl on radio asked by Kyle Sandlands if she'd been raped and broke down in tears, when you cannot control an emotional response. And when this negative teen talks about, well, maybe it would be useful if others maybe just saw that little smile here and then, it robs people of agency, it makes people tell others things they're not comfortable with, and we think that is deeply, deeply regrettable. 4 things in this speech. Firstly, why privacy matters. Secondly, how it won't be controlling in a bad way for individuals. Thirdly, on why communication gets worse with others. And lastly, substantive, on why this makes many people deeply unsafe. Firstly, on privacy. The negative team firstly argues that individuals consent to privacy, in that they grew up in a world with it such that it's the norm that everyone has come to expect. But that is not a sufficient level of consent to other people finding out information you expressly do not want them to know, in the same way that everyone grows up in a world with sexism, that is not an expression of consent to sexual harassment. And conversely, we would say that in our world, individuals grow up with a different barometer of privacy, and the question becomes which barometer is better, and that's what this speech will prove. But secondly, Kevin says we don't disclose the substance of your emotions, you just disclose bits and pieces. Both are bad. Firstly, people interpret it as the substance of your emotions. For example, when women smile when being sexually harassed to diffuse that situation, people think that is not problematic, and people think it is fine to do. But secondly, and Kevin says, will you choose who to be around you, i.e. on break night? This is the worst example for this negative team, because you do not choose the people around you on break night. You see people who got break, and you guys are celebrating, and maybe people like me aren't. And that's the problem. It's because you feel unintentionally, overjoyed and ecstatic, or other people break down in tears, and it is deeply embarrassing. And people are robbed of the ability to hide that if they do not want to show it. But thirdly, it does show the substance of your emotions, because people ask you direct questions. down in tears. They ask you if you've been sexually assaulted and you feel embarrassed. They ask you if you've had anxiety attacks and you don't want to answer that question. And all of those things force you to give up information you should not be forced to disclose. That is incredibly problematic, and we prefer a world where people are not obliged to say things they did not want to. Secondly, on whether this is controlling the individuals. They say, and their best claim, is that people will tell you to perform emotions in certain settings. They say that will likely lead to people saying, like, you can't be emotional like in a classroom, you can't be emotional in the workplace, because we know that you can control it. Firstly, people already do that. I know Kevin said it gets worse, but the first level response is that it is already extremely bad, yeah? Like, women constantly are told they should not be emotional, and the problem is that some people currently are very good at hiding their emotions, and people expect them to be like that in some circumstances anyway. So obviously, it doesn't get meaningfully worse. But secondly, I think it's better to challenge this norm in a controlled way. For example, Jacinda Ardern challenged the norm about using emotions in politics in a deft way, better than Theresa May breaking down in tears in her resignation speech, because she could not control her emotions. It is better that people challenge them in a controlled and measured way, rather than what you do on your side. Secondly, they said that power dynamics shape who is allowed to express emotions. That obviously already happens in the same way that women currently are told when they, have a high, I think it's scientifically true that there's high hormone menstruating period, I don't know, but that women are said that they should not be emotional when they cannot control it. And maybe it would be better if you could hide it and feel like you have control over your own emotions. The last thing to say is it leads to empathy because people know what you're feeling. But no, this ignores what Andrew says, in that most people's response to your friend feeling a bit, or someone you don't really know, feeling a bit alienated at a dating social, is not to go and ask that person how they're going, because you feel like you don't know if they wanted you to do that, you feel like that it's not your duty. But when someone is feeling sad and shows it to you, you know they are asking for a response. You know that you are compelled to do it, and people will likely be more empathetic on our side. Third issue, on communication. The negative team firstly says, this is an accurate form of communication and it is much easier because some people don't have the language to discuss their emotions in a sophisticated way. Firstly, as we said at first, that did not get a response, people misinterpret this information even if you convey it correctly. I.e., they only take a snippet of this information and use it against you, which is the reason why during arguments with your romantic partner, if you start breaking down in tears when you're breaking up with them, they will say things like, obviously you are sad, this is not something you want. Whereas you can control and process that emotion on our side and not let others manipulate that emotion against you. But secondly, they said that Kevin will say that people will think like you're lying if you're withholding things. Well, no, because everyone is generally knows that people can withhold their emotions, and will be, yes, some level of skepticism towards everyone, but not in a way that is meaningfully worse under the status quo. And we think it is better to proactively ask how people are going, to proactively ask what their emotions are, and there will be a norm of doing so where you don't just unintentionally smile here and there and your parents think you're happy. Thirdly, they said serendipitous interactions with others are nice and better. We think they're likely to be bad because, one, people who wanted to show happiness will still show their happiness, yeah? It's not a huge barrier to show smiling to someone else, to laugh at something, but we're just giving you the potential to say, I don't want to do that, yeah? You can still do those things if you want. And secondly, we think that many of those secrets are bad things to unintentionally show. Fourthly, now there is a norm to not, they said that now there will be a norm to be unemotional, but that is obviously wrong because we think at a young age you'll be taught that not to second guess other people, to actually ask how they're going, because you can't tell when people are withholding things from you. That means your inquiries as to other people's emotions are likely to be better. This is the thing that leads to emotional stunting of men, because they just think that women, when they say they're fine, but now you can actually be forced to ask whether that emotion is correct. Lastly, Kevin said it's better to have pent-up emotions. Anger is easily the best one on our side, because anger is worst when it is unintentional. In debates, when Kevin himself is very rude to the other people in debates, that's bad, that he can't hold that back and makes other people upset. When men are angry towards their girlfriends, it is bad they do that and don't feel like they can hold that back from other people. And anger is an emotion that we should be able to control, that many people aren't, and we regret that people aren't able to control that. It leads to dangerous situations that people are placed in. Lastly, on individual safety. Individuals are most often put in danger when they unintentionally express vulnerability. Because predators prey on vulnerability which many people find difficult to hide. Sexual harassers at bars look for women who look uncomfortable and alone, rather than women who look like they're expectantly waiting for their friends or feel confident in the area that they are in. People predate on children who look like they are scared or crying or alone, rather than want to feel like they are welcome in their community. Or people bully others at school when the weird kid starts crying or gets angry or throws a tantrum that kid cannot control. Being able to hide your emotions maybe in some circumstances makes communication awkward, but it prevents people from some of the most deeply traumatic and embarrassing things of your life, and it is something that we wish everyone in this room had.
Those are a person's suffering, those are a person's pain. The reasons they are keeping them secret is because they are afraid of being a burden to others, is because they don't want their own pain to go away at the expense of someone else's. And keeping people quiet about the things which make them suffer constantly, not giving people a pathway to communicate what are the most shameful parts of your life, the fact you are sad, the fact you are angry, the fact that you are depressed or anxious or have experienced trauma, is the way that you lock people into constant suffering. The way that people hide their emotions is the way that they suffer, and letting people have an outlet for emotions that are truly unintentional, truly uncontrollable, so strong that they change the ways that you break down, that you cry, that you can no longer hide it from people anymore. That is the way people ask for help, because they will never ask in words. And that is what this team denies to people of society. 2 questions in this debate. Firstly, what is the value of unintentional emotions and whether leaking secrets is truly a harmful thing? Secondly, whether making emotions intentional increases the value of those emotions. And thirdly, the ways in which this impacts relationships and the ways we communicate to people around us. Firstly, on the value of unintentional emotions. This team says that you have this inherent right to privacy and you ought not, have to leak secrets to people in the way that unintentional emotions work. The first thing we tell you is that a secret is not your feeling, the secret is the reason for that feeling, and you do not disclose the reason for that feeling. But what is important in Will's initial response here, which is that you misinterpret that initial response, like someone smiles and you're like, the reason must be they like me, is when you see the unintentional emotion, you clarify the reason, whereas if you do not, you base those interpretations based purely on things like gender, like she is a hot woman, so she must like me, and you don't seek to clarify. Asking the question, the clarification, is the way to ensure consent to the disclosure of the secret, because you are allowed to tell people whether you are fine, even if you're not fine, or you can choose to disclose the reasons behind it. The initial response is not the disclosure of the secret, but it allows the conversation which gives you permission to disclose that secret if it is someone that you want to disclose that secret to. Or it initiates a conversation which says this is a private matter that you cannot delve into, because that conversation can also go that way. And it is that initial disclosure through that emotion which actually allows you to preserve that privacy and protect against misinterpretations. The second thing we tell you is that you consent to the people around you. And Will says, but what about break night? I don't break very often. But we would prefer a world in which individuals that are celebrating obscenely are conscious of the fact that celebration is complicit in people's suffering and are able to adjust their behaviour based upon those people's suffering, right? That is a preferable world than a world in which someone is suffering in silence and someone is celebrating loudly, and it's likely the person that is suffering is more vulnerable or less good at debating than the person that is celebrating loudly, right? So that is not a harm. The third thing we tell you is that that most of these secrets are things that are actually good. Like if you are smiling, your eyes light up when you see someone that you're friends with, that is a nice secret to disclose to someone. Like, that makes someone a part of that secret. You create a communal, collective secret that is the two of us are close, the two of us are happy, and that is the kind of secret that gives inherent value to unintentional expressions of emotion. And those are the kinds of secrets that we do lose as well as the other ones in this debate, because the fact that we create new norms, the fact that we have a temporal lag, the fact that you are not guaranteed a reciprocal, authentic response means you are also less likely to show those nice communal secrets that you can create. Or they are secrets that are things about you suffering and you should not have to keep them. And the fact that you are is the reason that and the fact that you are and have only been able to express it in unintentional emotion is the reason that we should prioritize that person. The second thing they say here is that certain emotions are things we would prefer not to disclose. And the thing about this fear thing, which they reiterate a will as if it's a new point and not just the mechanism in Andrew's speech, is people aren't anxious and then get bullied. People are afraid because they are small. People are afraid because they are a minority. And that fear is not the reason they are bullied. It is because they know they are going to get bullied. But what fear does is signal to other people in the community to come and protect them, right? Like, that is good. If you see an anxious person, you see this dickhead, like, staring them down, you are more likely to go up and help that anxious person. And that is a good mechanism. You would not like, it's like a bully, like, sees you. Yeah, anyway. The second thing they say is, like, sadness is a cue, and I'll deal with this in emotions about people asking. But the important thing is sadness is often a reaction to something, and people know about the something even before they know about the sadness, so they're likely to ask about the something before they know about the sadness. Like, how's your exam go? I'm kind of sad about it, rather than like sadness is the cue for asking about their exam. The third thing they say is anger. If someone has anger control issues, like they feel rage uncontrollably, it is better that gets managed rather than that explodes one day, become like a room by themselves, pent up because they cannot keep it hidden anymore. So those are good things. Secondly then, on whether making it intentional increases the value of their emotions. The first thing they say is you're more likely to ask, but they never set up the reasons that norm doesn't exist in the status quo. Firstly, emotions, when they are more salient as part of the discourse and interactions with people, are likely to also be something you prioritize more in your relationships, which means the norm of asking is likely to be bigger in our side. We give you totally unresponded to analysis at Kevin about the fact that people feel shame, about the way that this would likely be codified similarly to language in a way that makes emotions something that is less salient, something that is more unusual and more unknowable, in a way that actually means you're less likely to ask about emotions than if emotions are part of the fabric of the interactions you have day to day with individuals. And that means that norm exists more on our side, but also the incentives to ask people you care about exist in both worlds. Like, a parent will often ask their child how they are doing, but in both worlds you can say, I'm fine. In one world, if you're really not fine, your voice will crack. And then your parent can then you can start a conversation by which someone can actually give you help, and that is a preferable world from one in which you can say fine and then the conversation stops, right? Uncontrollable responses are the way those people get to seek help, so even if you can ask, you cannot guarantee an honest response. So it is likely that something being intentional makes it worse. Quickly on how it changes emotions, the important thing to say in terms of their analysis about minorities, it's obviously worse in the world in which it's codified. About things being pent up, that's obviously worse in a world in which you have to consent to that coming out. And the nature of these emotions as being something that you now consent to actually makes them less dealt with or believable from another person. And this coercive thing, like if someone accidentally cries, you feel like you have to help them. But if someone accidentally cries, you know it's an accident, and that's surely backtrack if it's an accident. But if someone's doing it on purpose, that's when it feels coercive, and that's when you have less goodwill to help them, which is material we give you in canon speech, which is also why you're likely to get things like less political mobilization, because people that are suffering are doing it to get a response, rather than just because they are suffering. And that is also become in this debate. But note also that when someone is in a social situation in which, everyone's happy, but one person is not expressing it, because they are not happy, that also puts greater stigma on that person for not responding emotionally in the same way other people do. And inauthenticity is a right that people have greater to preserve things like that privacy, and to preserve things like those social fabrics. At the end of this speech, people should not be able to hide their suffering when the disclosure of that suffering gets you help, but also making emotions intentional decreases the value of those emotions to the most vulnerable, makes relationships less meaningful. We've won.
that at USU 1 wishes that they could have hid the fear in their eyes when they drew us in round 1. And the reason for that is because that display of fear left them vulnerable and open to bullying. Might reveal enough for me to know if they're just like a bit scared or actually need like important counselling or unintentionally. So I just leave it and bully them. That's what the display of emotions does. It gives you an insight, which is embarrassing, it's slightly true, but not revealing enough to make it so that people are able to have a proper relationship. I'm going to ask 2 questions in this speech. The first is, what does this do for communication, both for people who you're close to, or I guess theoretically people who you might be close to? They want to say here that, this would destroy friendships because you would never see like a glimmer in somebody's eye. The question we ask here immediately is, why is that an impulse that you would hide? Like if I want to laugh at a joke, and I think that the person who told the joke would appreciate that, I would still laugh. It appears to be reliant on this kind of model bash, which is bizarre in a hypothetical debate of this temporal lag or huge emotional labour, but it's not like that. Like, we think that this would be the equivalent to deciding whether or not to lift your arm to write or like spell your name. It's just something that can happen. It's a new different element of psychology. We established that from first. It's not something people would be aware of you hiding, because obviously if people were aware of the temporal lag, you would also be revealing whether or not you were upset if there was a moment of blankness and then you went back to happiness. So I kind of can't function for that in the debate. We think far more substantively that actually the majority of relationships are not built on fleeting moments of accidental emotion, because if you're close with someone, you show that emotion intentionally, but can actually be destroyed by that accidental display of emotion, which might be indicative of something that you are feeling fleetingly, but is not indicative of what your relationship is actually built on. That's things like feeling jealous or resentful towards a partner. That's things like, say, feeling attracted to somebody else when you don't want to let them know that that's something that could potentially happen. That's things like saying, for instance, feeling sad about something that you don't want to share for a very reasonable reason, but if your partner, you knew you weren't sharing that thing that was causing you distress, they would take that in a personal way. It is not reasonable to have an expectation on people to share everything with someone, no matter how close they are with them. It's reasonable to hide sadness, it's reasonable to hide resentment, it's reasonable to hide, for instance, fear in the case of an argument if you think it would make it less productive, and that is absolutely the kind of things we stand for. The negative team rather here wants to say things like, true feelings make up a relationship. Yes, you would still show those true feelings. People would also believe displays of emotions, because again, as we set up, it's not that you could say like, instead of crying, I will look like I'm having the day of my life. It's like, instead of crying, I will look like I'm mildly happy, or I will continue in the way I was pre this immediate sense of emotion. Like, we recognise it's a vague line to draw, but we think it's reasonable to say that you're not going to the total polar opposite, you're just going to the less revealing version of what you were previously. And again, on this idea that you would kind of constantly have this huge emotional labour, we don't think that's really in the spirit of emotion. The second thing I want to say here is that actually, like, the problem is, you notice that people are down and you're able to ask about it. Currently, you can't do that. The problem, first of all, as I alluded to in my introduction, is even if it's true that you notice people are down, you overestimate your ability to know what that being down is. So even if it's true that you recognise someone feels down, you think that is what they feel. They feel a bit down, I feel a bit down, we're all stressed about exams. And you assume then that your question of like asking whether or not they're okay or whatever is actually a total explanation of whether or not they're feeling sad, rather than saying, this person might be feeling sad and not saying that, so I shouldn't just assume their ability to dodge my question does mean that they are just a bit down, rather than actually dealing with something significantly more serious. But again, we don't think that in the majority of situations, people are hiding the fact that they're feeling down from meaningful things. Like this is probably a bit of an overshare, but like on Friday when I was at work, I was like, I just want to go home and like have a cry in the shower. Like, if the debating coordinators who'd been at Skegs had like seen that, I'm not suddenly going to become best friends with like Leanne from Grammar. It's just going to become really embarrassing, and I'm totally like entitled to have my cry in the shower. Like, you don't actually, like, sharing that with people isn't actually the kind of people who you normally want to share it with. It's fine, and when it is the people who you want to share it with, you want them to know that you might be deflecting, and that if you're not deflecting, so for instance you are getting tears in your eyes at a family dinner for no particular reason, that is intentional, and that is a far better way of reaching out. Because the reality is that it is true some people crack under pressure and let people know that they're feeling down. It is not true that the majority of people do that, or that the majority of people do that in a point where it's not too late to get help. We would far prefer the assumption be that people are hiding something, and the assumption be that you can push. So if your kid says, no, I'm fine, you don't think, well, they're fine. You think, hang on, that doesn't add up, you haven't been sleeping, like you haven't been eating, why is it that you say not going to social engagements anymore? And you make sure that people do actually take the initiative in those conversations. The final thing to say here on bottling up emotions is this actually means that you can confront emotions when you're dealing with them, because you're not worried that there will be that crisis moment. So for instance, to go back to my crisis on Friday, if I had known that I wouldn't have like spontaneously burst into tears, then I could have dealt with that sadness when I was alone in my office without being worried that that would like compromise me for the rest of the day. So actually bottling up emotions is far worse when even considering emotions has the chance of creating a fountain of emotions rather than dealing with it in a time appropriate way. That's why in your relationships with others who are being benevolent towards you, this is hugely destructive even if they have good intentions. Secondly though, why do we think it is that broadly this reveals things about yourself that you just, that this is generally bad for your identity? What they want to say here is like the feeling of sadness or the feeling of disappointment is not particularly substantive. That's not a huge revelation. First of all, in many cases it is. If it seems like frustration with life or anxiety, the feeling in itself is incredibly revelatory. To say the person sitting next to you in a tutorial when you get a shit quiz mark back. My life hasn't been going very well recently. And so we think that is hugely revelatory, but also it doesn't matter if they think it's substantive or not. The question should just be whether or not the person feels it's substantive. And when you look back to the times that you've revealed something, you probably realise that that does feel substantive to you. And again, that speaks to the exact problem, which is to the people revealing emotions, they feel incredibly embarrassed. But the people interpreting emotions, they do not know what they're interpreting. And we ought judge things like privacy by individuals' feeling of their identity being compromised rather than necessarily other people's ability to compromise them. The final Hail Mary on this idea of like what principally world is a better place is they say that this makes emotions far more policed. But actually the policing of emotions comes from the fact that that's something that privileged people who aren't particularly invested in decisions are able to do. Because if you know you're going to be fine either way, or you have your finances sorted, or you're not particularly susceptible to bullying, it is easy to look fine, and that is when the imposition of, say, not looking stressed is imposed on people. If, by contrast, everybody cannot look stressed, then it will be a reasonable way of communication. And they want to say, well, then people will be saying you're just crying for show. That is currently leveled at people, and it is untrue. Now, crying will be a meaningful form of communication. Dickheads might still say you're crying for show, but at least if you're crying, people know that it's reasonable. And when you do cry, it's a cry for help. It's not something that might piss off the person next to you or be misinterpreted or make you seem like a bad friend. The reality is that most often the emotions that are shown are not helpful. They are demonstrations of fear when that fear would not be helpful because otherwise you could choose to look fearful, or they are demonstrations of being hurt when that's deeply embarrassing. This makes people incredibly vulnerable and we would never support it.
Thanks, Imogen, for that speech. Welcome the first speaker to the negative.
All that side Affirmative has done in this debate is identify a range of instances in which you might prefer to keep your emotions private. That does not win the debate because it is woefully uncomparative to the world in which we would now live under their side of the house, which by their own analysis, people would hide their emotions more and take advantage of the fact that they did not have to do that because, firstly, they were subject to the societal pressures which told them that those emotions were bad or invalid and they were ashamed for feeling that. But secondly, they now also have this additional pressure, which is that the display of emotion is a conscious one that is done for a calculated effect on the people around you, which robs it of its genuineness when you experience it out in the world. what that means is that in both worlds, you are subject to pressure, either in their world you're like forced to reveal emotions you don't want to. In our world, you are unable to reveal emotions that you do want to because you now live in a world where that is no longer normal or acceptable. We tell you that our world has much bigger harms because the harms on their side of embarrassment are, yes, not very pleasant, but the harms on our side are the helplessness and alienation you feel when you cannot relate to the humans around you. We think those are much worse because firstly, those harms are universal, so everybody is affected by those norms changing, regardless of how emotional or unemotional they happen to be. Now all of those people feel like it's more difficult to express those emotions. But secondly, they are the worst for the most vulnerable people. So we are talking about the people outside the house that they have never engaged with, who are like suffering from severe depression or mental illness, who now feel like if they cry in front of other people, those other people are going to think they're doing it for attention. And those are the sorts of people who on our side, we give a hope of rescue, because they're the people who do not tell you that they're thinking of committing suicide, for example, and they're the only people you can ever save by observing that they are visibly unhappy and depressed. When you cut those people away from that like non-verbal method of reaching out to other people, that is the situation in which those people suffer the most severe harms. So, firstly, why do we think that, firstly, looking at how these displays of negative emotion operate, this is where all of their own analysis explains why people would not be emotional under their world. So you keep it private because it's a vulnerable feeling, because you feel burdensome, because of the power dynamics that Kevin told you about, which means that we train children, for example, to hide the way that they feel, and also because of the societal pressure to not react in a certain way. Also, in many instances, the things that you're feeling are incredibly difficult to verbalize. That's why when they tell you about asking people how they feel, is never going to address that, because oftentimes you cannot explain in words the emotions that you are feeling, and it is only through the unconscious expression of your sense of that feeling that you're able to indicate any sort of kind of intuition. They tell you that it's not good because it's only partial information. But their comparative is no information, because people just do not let other people into their lives for all of the reasons of concerns about privacy that they've helpfully established. That's bad because humans desire company and contact and empathy, and it is better for them to not isolate themselves from people around them. But also, we tell you at Maddie that it prevents other people from assisting you. So it is good if you are like visibly uncomfortable in a workplace situation because someone is hitting on you, that other people can perceive that discomfort rather than thinking that you're fine and everything's fine. In a world where you're pressured to not let on that you're uncomfortable, that means you never actually are able to get help, either directly for yourself or from other people stepping in and identifying that. So, let's then go through what is effectively just a list of examples that side Affirmative has given you and explain why they're either not true or irrelevant. Firstly, on whether or not people are going to be bullied, we tell you that people are bullied anyway. You bully people because you know they are scared. Whether or not they show that fear doesn't necessarily matter. You can also get practical benefits out of bullying them, like their lunch money. But also, we think in some instances, the fact that you get a response is actually what makes it worth it, and that if you start crying, they stop bullying you, so that's a good thing. Yes, that's also something they can do on their side of the house, but we think that it is not true that predators disappear on their side of the house. So predators still exist. There's still a guy in the bar trying to find a woman. Now he just randomly picks a woman as opposed to picking the one that looks slightly nervous. We think in our world, the woman that looks slightly nervous is then approached by bar staff who say, hey, you okay, what's going on? And do all those sorts of things that respond to how people view them, rather than, so this is the point here is they just don't eliminate predators out of this world, they just change how it's targeted, and you get rid of our help escape mechanism. So, on asking people about how they feel, obviously, people can still ask their children how they are under the status quo. They do that under the status quo, but people do not say how they feel. Children do not tell their parents how they're feeling. They give you no reason as to why you would be more likely to tell it. Instead, they prop this bizarre world in which you ask if someone's okay and they tell you they're fine, and then you keep interrogating them about whether or not they're okay and badgering them again and again and again to get some sort of answer. We think that is much less likely to ever be effective than being able to say, well, you are crying, that is why I intuit that you are upset, please, do you want to talk to me about it? Those are the sorts of non-verbal entrances into conversation which do not exist in a world in which your displays of emotion do not come through without you consciously deciding to do it. We're talking about how people don't ask about how you're feeling to respect your privacy. We think that this is the exact same under their side of the house, and there's the added harm because now, in the instance where you show emotion, people are less sympathetic to that emotion because they think you are doing it as a cry for help. That's where Imogen's point about how, under both sides leveled at people. Under their world, that is an accusation that is always true because you are crying for show. Under our side, emotions are viewed as something which you cannot have control over your expression of them, which is why people feel empathetic or sorry for you when you're having those emotional breakdowns. That is something they totally remove. We also think in terms of like acting out in the heat of anger. You still act in anger. You might not express the anger on your face, but you're still acting in anger, so that's not part of this debate. In terms of crying during a breakup, it's not like if you're like crying when you're breaking up with someone, they're like, oh, see, you're crying, you must be sad. You're like, oh, okay, I guess I won't break up with you then. I'm sorry, I changed my mind. Like, just because you express some emotions doesn't mean people can force you to change how you behave because they identified some of those emotions. So, what that then means is the only thing that they have in this debate is this idea that you wish you didn't cry in front of people and that is embarrassing. Firstly, for those people, you still feel that emotional response, you still want to cry, you were just told it is invalid and you're ashamed of it, and that means you don't actually deal with the emotion, you just close it down, and even if they think that you'd rather cry in your office, we tell you that that locks you away from other support networks, and it's better that you do it in front of other people, and that the coordinator from grammar might give you a hug, and that's a good thing. Secondly, we think that challenging those norms becomes impossible in their world because this means that it is no longer like if women and minority groups are more emotional, which we think they are likely to be more emotional because they have a whole range of things to be very angry about, that expression of emotion now becomes less valid. In the business context, you cannot like be emotional and get worked up in that workforce. And what that means is it just further alienates people who feel those emotions but are told that that emotion is unacceptable in society, and it is much worse, rather than a world in which we break down the barriers to expressing those emotions and accept them within society and say they should be something to be valid. Finally, you lose all empathy because the emotions have currency when they are involuntary and when they are genuine. That is what makes people feel empathetic towards you. That means that personally you feel less empathetic towards people you see crying because you think that they are doing it for attention, but also you feel less empathetic to things like refugees or women who cry on TV when their children are shot because you now know that they are choosing to cry on TV and you think they are doing it to gain political capital. Those are all already accusations that are leveled, but they become unavoidably true on our side of the house. That meant that we had the worst outcomes for the people who most needed to be able to express their emotions on side negative. We win this debate.
That I've been mean to you in a debate, it wasn't because I lost control. I did genuinely mean those things. The to identify with the negative team, with the affirmative team, is that they never deal with the collection of norms which we tell you exist in both worlds, which say that certain emotions and the display of those emotions is something shameful and something that you should hide. Because we tell you that there's always a shame attached to displaying vulnerability or your dependence upon others, which dissuades you from expressing your sadness or your depression. That you don't want to burden other people around you with your emotions and the emotional labor that that involves. That making a choice means acknowledging that you have a problem and acknowledging that you do not have the tools with which to deal with that problem. Which means that the problem for the affirmative team is this. In our world, the people most in need of help, the people least in control of their emotions, are the most likely to get that help because their vulnerability is visible to other people. In their world, those individuals are still vulnerable. They still feel the deep sadness that Imogen felt in her office at Skirts on Friday, but their suffering is invisible to the world around them. And that locks them out from ever seeking the types of assistance which are necessary for individuals to get over that problem. So the harms of that are twofold. The first is, we told you that you are never likely to disclose information or seek help, because you can say no and no and no over again. If it is truly as something as involuntary as lifting your arm in the debate, it will be exceptionally easy for children, as is the characterization of the affirmative team, to engage in that type of behaviour of denial. But the second and more important harm is that when you do seek help, even in the slim minority of chances that the affirmative team still afford themselves, that help will be ineffective. Firstly, for the reason that people are more likely to treat you as being a burden and ask you, why are you the one choosing to disclose this information to me? Why not the other people that you're friends with? Why not anyone else? And for the second reason, that it makes you less empathetic when it's a choice. Because you say to yourself, well, I wouldn't have made the choice to disclose that information. That was a bad decision for that person to make. You ask yourself, did that person choose to fake it? Did that person choose to fake their emotion? Are they displaying the real emotion? Are they displaying not the true extent of their emotion? Those are the questions that the affirmative team's world prompts individuals to ask in a way that makes them, even in the scenarios where people do approach them for help, less effective at providing that assistance to individuals. And I understand that the Affirmative team has proven a large number of possible harms to individuals in their ability to escape from situations of vulnerability, but the problem is that they do not offer them a way in which to escape those situations. They say that bullying happens. They say that the accidental disclosure of the fact that you're gay happens. Well, people still bully other individuals out of dynamics of power. You're still not going to be able to convincingly answer a question about your sexuality. The problem is that you never display the discomfort that those questions cause you, or that bullying helps you, that in a way that makes other people likely to render you assistance. But the second argument that the Affirmative team literally never deals with is the argument about the way in which this enforces power structures over individuals' emotions. Because we tell you that when it's a choice that you can make, no matter how easy it is to make that choice, there is still an expectation of the scenarios and the social settings in which making those choices are valid. You're more likely to train your children, and others are more likely to feel justified in controlling your ability to express your emotions. Those emotions are more likely to be examined as having a semiotic value as attached to certain forms of emotion as opposed to others, which means that power structures are ingrained more than they are under the status quo, when individuals currently can say, well, it's difficult to control emotions, so it is acceptable to express them even in scenarios where it might not be preferable to. It damages the relationship between people of different cultures when their expectations of how you ought to display emotion vary in the way that those cultures have developed those relations. But the final thing to say is that this destroys the capacity to have genuine relationships. Because your ability to control your emotions, your ability to not disclose the things that you might find slightly embarrassing to your partner, are precisely the same things that prevent you from disclosing the everyday things that cost you emotional labor. The look of love that you might give to a loved one is something that you constantly now have to remind yourself to display to that person, as opposed to something that you choose to do as part of the course. This destroys relationships, it makes people less empathetic.
Firstly, does it benefit you as an individual to be able to control your own emotions, and then secondly, is it good for you as the individual that other people around you can control theirs as well? On the first issue, as to whether it benefits you yourself in the way that you control your emotions, there were three broad things said in this debate. The first of those was on this idea of pressure to control your emotions. We tell you that this pressure exists at the moment for people, and the response to this from the opposition is a suggestion that it would increase. I think the thing that they fail to do, as Will points out immediately in response, is prove how much worse this can actually get to people. Because there already is a large extent of pressure on people to be able to do it, and the reason we give you for that is that some people are better than others at actually succeeding in this. Importantly though, the distinction is, meeting this societal norm is actually possible under our side of the house, and is not possible for individuals, many individuals, under the negative sides. That is crucial for two reasons. Firstly, because the unequal distribution of this power means that some people have it worse than others, as I tell you from my speech, and that in and of itself is a reason we should object to that norm in the way that carries out at the moment. But secondly, that it's particularly skewed against women and minorities. And Imogen tells you in her speech that privileged people can control when they're not invested, so they're the ones who set these norms about not being emotional, and this is what the responses we hear in Theo's speech and down the negative team's bench miss in this debate. The second reason that this is crucial is that the consequence of not being able to meet this societal norm is really bad. So if we're the only side in which people can meet that norm consistently, then we must be coming out ahead for those people. We tell you that the result of this is that you get alienated, we tell you that you get bullied, and the only response that we hear to this down the negative team's bench is that you'll be said that you were just trying to show where you're calculated, but again, that is uncomparative to a way that is directed by privileged people at minorities at the moment. They are told that they are just doing it to show, they are told that they should learn to control their emotions, even though they can't. So even if the negative team prove that being forced to hide their emotions is bad, the harm of failing to do that is greater on their side of the house. The second question within this is about vulnerable people. The negative team is premised on the assumption that these people will act against their own interests. Because for every single time they say that these people could act and they show their emotions and people would help them, but they won't, it is unclear throughout any of their speeches why an individual would choose to do that. What we say then, they say, even when Theo says humans desire empathy and human contact, they can seek that out under our world through the exact same mechanism that they would under their world. And this is why Neg is wildly insufficient in response to our material on bullying and harassment. Because we tell you, you can still walk away in awkwardness, or you can glance and grimace at the bartender or a colleague, but you don't accidentally smile at the person who is harassing you, and in that way encourage them to continue in a way that they perceive it as encouragement. The next thing that they talk about is mental health issues, which gets a lot of attention in this debate, and I think maybe gets the negative team closest to this insufficient. They say you force people to deal with their own, suffering rather than see others, because they say that these people become invisible. Firstly, these people are often good at hiding these things anyway, as I tell you from my speech, especially to their parents. But secondly, people don't know whether to ask after them or not. The thing that changes on the outside is you can choose who you display that emotion to. And the response we hear to this from the negative team is that those people would apparently say, why would you choose me? Which flagrantly contradicts their point at second, which says that this interaction creates connections between people when you do display your emotions to each other. I think the logical response, as we tell you down the bench, is that you would know that it's no accident that they're seeking your help. You would feel encouraged and feel like you are their close friend at the point that they do, and you know it's a cry for help. That means you're more likely to pursue them and help them in those good ways. So the conclusion of that, and I think was where the negative team's case lay, we clearly show why it's better for these individuals. I think I also gave a lot of material on the second issue in my first speech, which I unresponded to. That was to say about the misunderstanding, for example, people's intentions. Theo misinterprets that point. What we say there is that, for example, if someone breaks up with you and they look sad, then you as the person who got dumped might think, oh, they don't actually want to break up with me, but if they get to hide that emotion from you, that is better for both you and them. At the conclusion of this speech, it is better for the individual who hides the emotions, it is better who is the recipient of hidden emotions or expressed emotions. We're very proud to.